Hello everyone and welcome to our video about the hobby horse mane. I'm Julianne from 𝗪𝗪𝗘 and today I'm going to show you how to create a mane of yarn for your hobby horse. You have various options when choosing the yarn. On the one hand, you can use a relatively thin wool like this one. However, you will then have to use several strands at the same time when tying it on. Otherwise, your hobby horse will look a bit bald. Alternatively, you can also use a very thick yarn, such as this one. Then you can achieve a relatively voluminous look with a single strand that looks great. You will also need a hand sewing needle and some sewing thread. First of all, be prepared. We need a lot of strands of yarn so that we don't have to cut them all individually. I'm going to use this book to help me. I simply wrap the wool around it several times and then cut it on one side, and then I have strands that are about as long in total as one page of the book. So that's about it. You just have to know how to help yourself. I'll now show you how it all works. And now I'll just cut down here, along here, and I have a whole stack. That's too short, but they're perfect. A whole pile of strands of hair. I'm going to do the whole thing 2 or 3 more times because of course that's not enough for my mane. How much you need in total also depends on the thickness of the yarn. It's medium thick now. We have another thicker one, but it's a bit thinner in comparison. And I think I'll have to cut 2 or 3 more times that amount. At least that is my assumption. All these individual strands that we have now cut will now be tied to this basic thread at Hobby Horse. I have already pulled in this basic thread while I was sewing so that I don't have any knots at the top. If you haven't done this yet, you can simply use an extra piece of yarn. This also works. Make a knot after maybe 30 centimeters or so. It doesn't have to be accurate to the centimeter. And then sew the knot about 2 centimeters after this seam here to the front headband, and then you can use this as a base thread as normal. Now before we can start tying the knot, the first thing I have to do is pull in an auxiliary thread made from sewing thread. The background to this is that we're going to sew these individual strands in place because otherwise the mane will naturally flop back and forth. That's why it has to be sewn in place. It's best to use a basic thread in the same color as your mane. So that you can see it better, I have now used a contrasting color thread again. And now I'll just pull it to the point where the base thread comes out into the fabric. And then I put the needle here on the side so that I can sew the whole thing in place every time I have tied a strand. I now have one of my cut strands here, and the principle of tying goes like this. You double this strand so that a loop is created at the top, and you pass this loop under the base thread, and then simply pull the ends through this loop and fold the thread over to the opposite side of the loop, and then pull the whole thing nice and tight and push it as close as possible to the beginning of the base thread. And now I sew this knot tight. Let's do it. There are now various ways of sewing this knot. You can simply push the needle through the knot and then into the fabric. But I have another technique that involves tying this auxiliary thread again at the same time. This is relatively practical if you are already further down and have already knotted many strands and the thread breaks. This has already happened to me 2 or 3 times, and then I had to sew everything on again. Of course, that was not so great. But if this auxiliary thread itself is knotted beforehand, then you can save yourself the trouble of having to sew everything on again. I hope you can save this unnecessary time. So I'll show you how I do it. So I make a little loop here and stitch over this auxiliary thread into the fabric to the other side. It is important that you really stitch through the fabric, and then I pull the whole thing tight. So on the one hand, this knot here is pulled nice and tight from the strand to the beginning, and secondly, I now have a loop here through which the thread is knotted, and the whole thing, I then do the whole thing again in a similar way so that I have a second knot. Okay, great. With a second loop. And with that, the auxiliary thread itself is knotted really tightly. This means that if it breaks at the bottom here, I have sewn the previous strand on tightly and can simply continue with a new thread. So I'll put this back over here and then thread the next strand. Push it tight again, and then in the same way, this knot again. You don't necessarily have to do this double knotting of the auxiliary thread for every strand. You can theoretically just do it for every second, third, or fourth strand, just so that if the thread breaks, you don't have to sew everything on again. It is important that you always stay in the middle of this back main bar when sewing with this basic thread, so that the main is really in the middle and can theoretically be folded over to both sides. I have now reached the end of my main. In theory, you could also do it a bit further down or stop further up. It really is a question of personal taste. And I'm sure you have good taste. I'm going to stop at this point and I'm going to knot my basic thread, this end that I still have left here with the last strand. And now I sew this last knot really tight with my auxiliary thread down here, then cut off the auxiliary thread, and then the main is finished. Now that the main is finished, let's take care of the mop of hair. While I was sewing my hobby horse, I made a loop like this for the top of the head. If you haven't done this, you can of course do it afterwards by simply taking a piece of your wool and tying a knot so that you have a small loop. It should be about 2 to 3 centimeters long. If you measure in inches, then 0.8 to 1.2 inch, whatever you prefer. Then you can cut it off at the back and sew this knot in place. Then you'll basically get the same result as I have here. Again, I'm going to pull in an auxiliary thread that I'll use to sew the whole thing down later. And I'll put it to one side here for now. The principle is the same as for the mane. I now always take a strand of hair, put it into a loop, and tie it to this basic thread. Tighten again like this, and nicely to the beginning of the base thread. And I do the whole thing until this entire loop is filled with strands. I have now tied in all the strands, and now of course I have to sew this loop in place. I do this by laying them a little straight between the ears and then making them more tapered at the front. This gives the mop of hair a nice shape regardless of whether you fold it over to the front, i.e. these strands, or to the back. It just looks best with this shape. I simply take my auxiliary thread and sew the whole thing in place by hand with a few stitches. Once you have attached all the strands, you can now shorten the individual strands. I now leave the mane exactly as long as it is. This is a great length for creating hairstyles, plaits, etc. However, I'm going to shorten the mop of hair a little to make the whole thing look a bit fringier. And with that, the little horse is finished. I hope you've made good progress. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments. And yes, I hope you get really great manes for your hobby horses, and I look forward to seeing you again. Take care.